Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are about to an echo.
I hear it, I think.
Is that because I have two accounts open? Is it my phone? Oh, there we go. Check.
I still can hear it now. I hear it there, but I don't, there's not a computer, right?
Hello? Okay. We're gonna try to get rid of this echo real quick and we'll get started in just a second here. I didn't hear the echo now. We're good? Okay, cool, excellent. Well, welcome. I'm Sean Kennedy.
I'm Martha Cantu.
And yeah, we're gonna take a look at chapters 18 through, I believe, 26 today. Perhaps we should just do a recap of the story. Harriet Jacobs, we enter the story back on page 1 when she's 6 years old, doesn't even know she's a slave. And she finds out through a tragedy when her mother dies. And then she is sold to a kind slave owner who teaches her to read and write, but despite her kindness, is unwilling to set her free. And unfortunately, when she's 12, is sold to very mean people, the Flints, and as the pseudonym. And almost immediately, Dr. Flint is making sexual advances on her. Remember, she is 12, 13, 14, 15 years old when this is happening, and he is probably at that point 40-ish, 50 years old. The wife is a bitter mistress, as typical of most mistresses in the situation, which we can empathize with. They are, as much wealth as they have and prestige as they have, they are powerless because they are women in the antebellum South. And so when they are either suspecting or know full well that their husbands are raping their slaves and having children with them, all they have to empower themselves is to be embittered towards the enslaved women. And so Linda, Harriet, is going to feel the brunt of that bitterness throughout her stay with them. But she continues on. She's surrounded with this horror, but she does have her grandmother there that probably helped her survive throughout this horrific tale. She devises a plan at some point to engage in a sexual consensual relationship with a Mr. Sands, who's a lawyer, quite wealthy and well known in this community. It's pretty clear that she, in part, decides to get connected with this man because he is precisely more prestigious than Mr. Flint or Dr. Flint. They have 2 children together, and her idea is that this will anger Dr. Flint and he will grow tired of her and sell her, give her freedom. That backfires on her, though. He only becomes more determined than ever. Prior to that, I'm sorry, she develops another relationship with a free Black man, and that's pretty tragic. It's really tragic, that relationship, because I was thinking of my first love and just how innocent, invigorating that is. You're just a complete fool when that happens for the first time in your life. And it's such a memorable occasion, and just to see it poisoned through this institution of slavery. And basically she has to leave this man because Dr. Flint is threatening to kill him if he ever comes near. And so that relationship is ended, and that's when she takes on the relationship with Mr. Sands in this story. And so she has these 2 children, and this kind of resolves her, makes her focused on trying to get her and her children free, to no avail. She's continuously pestered by Dr. Flint, And he basically says, gives her an ultimatum, you and your children are gonna be sent to the plantation. Your children will be broken, right, brutalized at this plantation, unless you comply. And he even says, hey, I'll even sweeten the deal. We'll create a cottage about 4 miles away from the house. You'll never have to deal with my wife again. And she flat out says, I would rather be a slave on a plantation than to deal with this
Right.
nonsense that you're proposing, because I don't believe you.
Mhm.
And so they're sent to the plantation. When she realizes after a while of being on this plantation that her children are going to be sold or sent to this plantation, she resolves to run away. And basically getting us to where we're at, she runs away, and it gets us to the story where now she is in this swamp, trying to figure out what she's going to do. And so her family is terribly worried about her, and they're trying to figure out where to put her. And I think this is, despite the horror of what's going on, what is inspiring about this is we're seeing various characters come together to help her with tremendous risk to themselves. They don't have to do this, but obviously family members, your grandmother cares about her, Uncle Philip cares about her, Betty cares about her, the cook cares about her, so they are willing to take on this risk to go through there. So we can begin there. She's in the swamp.
Right.
She's riddled with mosquitoes. She's being bitten by some sort of reptile, probably a snake, a poisonous snake, which she doesn't make any note of this, but I was just thinking, even the land itself is against her, right? Every turn, just she's running into these incredible challenges. And so she's trying to maintain, but after a while, the pain is just so acute that she needs to leave the swamp and to find somewhere safer for her to be. And this is where she is going to be befriended by a friend of the grandmother, a slave owner, who was a very kind person, that talks with Linda and says, tell me your story, what's going on? Linda tells her, and it's very clear that this woman who is a mother takes pity on her and says, I will help you. Please trust me. And Linda intuitively understands that she could trust this person. And so she basically is going to stay in a spare bedroom that is well hidden indefinitely there, but that's not going to last long as well. But in this chapter 18, this is where it's chapter 18 or chapter 19, where Jenny, one of the slaves,
18,
yeah, has some keys, and she's trying to get into this room where Linda is hiding. She doesn't have the key, so she's unable to get into this room, but this troubles Linda quite a bit, because it's not only that she might get caught, but she's endangering this very kind woman who is risking quite a bit by harboring her. Right.
So, and it's interesting that the white benefactress, the one that's going to help her, conceal her for a while, she tells on our page 86, she says, at last, she said, Aunt Martha, I pity. So now the white benefactress is talking to Linda's grandmother, Harriet's grandmother, and says, Aunt Martha, I pity you both. If you think there is any chance of Linda getting to the Free States, I will conceal her for a time. So number one, I think it's a very limited offer, right? I will conceal her for a little bit, but I really don't, I will help you to a certain point, but I'm not really gonna, lose my place in society, my livelihood. I'm not gonna become a full-fledged abolitionist, but I will help you to a point.
Yeah.
Right. So that's just for a limited time. And also then it's where was I? For a time, but first you must solemnly promise that my name shall never be mentioned, because she's, like you said, worried about her place in society, and there was retributions. If such a thing should become known, it would ruin me and my family. No one in my house must know of it except the cook. She is so faithful that that I would trust her with my own life with her. So I find that so, I guess, crazy to think like she's my slave. Supposedly she's inferior, but I will trust her with my own life. Like, and there's supposedly there are these rebellious people, people that, you know, of poor character, ignorant, inferior, but yet I will trust her with my life.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a very complicated relationship, right? And also, like I said, not ready to be a full-fledged abolitionist. She is herself is a slave owner, so it's just, but she will help, you know, she will help Aunt Martha, because I guess they're, whether they want it or not, personal bonds and relationships do develop through in
Yeah,
that slavery.
They're human beings after all.
Right.
So
Mhm,
human beings, yeah, they will have connections. And to be fair to this benefactor, to this woman, obviously she's worried about her prestige, right? This would be quite damaging to harbor a runaway slave, but you know, she's also a woman in the antebellum South, and I'm
Right.
sure this woman is terrified of her husband. They don't really talk too much about her husband, except that he's a slave owner. He's not a very kind slave owner. Yeah, she would, at the very least, be beaten for this by her husband,
So
most certainly. So this is something that's,
which I wrote down right now when you were talking about women being powerless,
Mhm.
right? Like you were saying. And I remembered the Grimke sisters,
Yeah.
from South Carolina, right? That it's almost like they have to take the same steps as a runaway slave for them to leave and flee from slavery, because they have to leave their family, they have to leave their wealth, they have to, you know, they're hated in South Carolina. Like, I think the governments would pass these resolutions that if they ever come back, the Grimke sisters were two white women from South Carolina, and they Angelina Grimke starts to like get this Christian feeling about, I'm going to hell because I'm part of this, right? And I need to leave, right?
extraordinary.
And so she does leave, but in this, I mean, I'm not saying it's not equivalent, but it's similar to a runaway slave, because where does she go? You know, she doesn't have money of her own. She's also a woman, and so she has to flee slavery. She flees slavery, and has to go find someone to help her. You know, and she leaves her fancy, you know, life and works with William Lloyd Garrison. And so,
Goes on the speaking circuit.
right. So I wonder also if she just didn't want that life for her, right? That, like, that ugly slave owner's wife, you know, that she knew what would be of her life, right? If she stayed in that kind of power structure where her husband would probably father children, and she didn't, you know, this wasn't an attractive system.
Yeah, it looked very deceiving, right? I could see just being a young woman, being like this handsome plantation owner, very wealthy, powerful, politician.
Which is what the South all about.
Yeah, exactly, right? And then a couple of years into it, you're living this great life, sipping your sweet tea in the backyard, and you're looking in the backyard, and you're just like, I'll be damned, those children have my husband's ears. He's not hanging out in the study in the middle of the night doing the books. And so it would just be devastating. And then to realize, you know, it's bad enough in any marriage if there's infidelity, especially to that extent, because we're talking about sexual assault. But there's nothing you can do, right? You can't even bring it up.
They're a slave to the system himself.
Right. And not only can't you bring it up because your husband has absolute authority, but there's this idea of the proper woman. Right. And so even like if you challenged your husband saying, are you having sex with these slaves? Can we have a talk here? You can't talk about sex. You can't even say I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. If she's confined in her, you know, her confinement is what they would call it.
Yeah, these euphemisms. And this is something that plagues Harriet throughout this book of why she has a lot of shame. She has been brought up to like, I am going to be a proper woman. I'm going to be a Christian proper woman. And what the story of her with Mr. Sands reveals is that as a slave and as a woman in the antebellum South, there is no doing good things.
Mhm.
If you try to do a good thing, it's going to backfire on you.
Right.
And, you know, in her quest for freedom, it backfires on her. Not only does she know that everybody is going to look down on her for having two children out of wedlock, her grandmother shames her in the most devastating way.
Mhm.
It really was ugly what her grandmother did. Understandable though.
Mhm.
If that is your mindset of, in order to have sexual relations with a man, you have to be married.
Right.
Which, you know, there's problems with third wave feminism. I don't agree with those contentions, but people bring up these problems. But I think the thing that we can be grateful for is today we can have very candid, honest, healthy conversations about
Right.
sexuality without this idea of shame coming upon,
Mhm.
especially in the case of abuse,
Right.
where nobody's going to look down on you going, well, what did you do? Well, people
Right.
still do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
yeah.
there's a broader audience to at least have sympathy and empathy for a person in this situation where that is not true at this
Mhm.
point. One great line in chapter 18, I have resolved that, and this is on page 85, 86, I resolve that come what would, there would be no turning back. Give
Mhm.
me liberty or give me death was
Mhm.
my motto,
Mhm.
right? Evoking the great Patrick Henry,
Right.
right?
So I think that's when we've talked about agency in her life. They tell her you can. Dr. Flint says remember we talked about last time. There's a sunny side and a dark side. There's two sides to this coin. Like you can accept my offer and go be my mistress, or I'm going to send you the plantation. Right?
Mhm.
You can choose A or you can choose B. And
Such a
she's like,
godfather. Jeez.
and she says, I'm
Terrible.
going to choose C. Right?
Well, great point.
Yeah, she's
Right.
like, you're gonna give me two choices. I'm gonna choose a third. I'm gonna make a third choice for me, and that's gonna be to run away, because she doesn't want that for her children, right?
Mhm.
And so we'll get to that when Mr. Sands is like, you need to free my kids in the other
Yeah.
chapters.
Another great line, or a good line here, that kind of reveals some of these tropes and stereotypes of enslaved people and Black people in general. But thus far, I had outwitted him. This is on page 87. Thus far, I had outwitted him. She's talking about Dr. Flint, and
Mhm.
triumphed over him, and
Mhm.
triumphed over it. Who can blame slaves for being cunning?
Mhm.
Right? They are constantly compelled to resort to it. It is only the weapon of the weak and the oppressed against the strength of their tyrants, right?
Mhm.
What I found interesting about this, and there's another chapter that we'll be discussing in a little bit, the competition of cunningness, where we're seeing like they're trying to outwit each other when he thinks she's in New York. This is a trope. This is a stereotype that enslavers have imposed on enslaved people, that they're cunning, right? They're kind of childlike, but you got to keep an eye on them because they're a little tricky, right? They're always up to something, right? And this is why I think what she's talking to, like, yeah, who can blame us for being cunning?
Yeah.
Right?
And so that's part of there's I guess part of the history of resistance. There's like the daily resistance, right? That like you had mentioned that I think you mentioned last week with your guest that it was these daily, like we'll break the machine or we'll break my own hand to not work, or
and act ignorant and stupid, right? With and they were probably most likely very intelligent or just average intelligence, normal people. They would just be like, I don't know, so it just broke, right? And then they would walk away like, get out of here, whatever, dude. Right? We ain't working today.
Yeah. But like it says, who can blame them? I mean, that's they have to figure out a way to survive.
Yeah, they're compelled, as she points it. And then as true fashion with the Flints, they're still horrible people. They send her family to prison.
Right.
And is that in chapter 18? Am I getting ahead of ourselves here?
Children sold. Let's see, months of peril.
My aunt was taken out of jail. Yeah. This is chapter. Yeah, they're sent to prison. So her two children, Philip, I think, is sent there. Her brother is sent to jail, or no, her brother is actually able to help. But yeah, they're all sent to prison or this jail. As basically leverage and hoping to draw her out, which almost worked. She's very, and I can't imagine that as a parent, especially in this hostile regime, it would take, I don't know how she did it, but it would take everything to stop me from visiting my children in this makeshift jail. But she's, her brother warns her, please don't.
Right, because then now it's gonna be worse.
It's gonna be worse.
Like you can just hold on, because you've already made this decision.
Yeah.
It's funny how like even her grandmother is telling her, don't do it. Don't like go ask for forgiveness, right? After she leaves, she's like, go back and let him make an example of you. But this is better than what you're gonna bring all this on us. And so we've talked about how does this system work like for so long, because it was 200 years of 250 years
back to the 1620s, right? Or 1630s, 1640s,
and it
right?
was the traumatization. And this, you see like the traumatization of the entire family, like the grandma saying don't do it, and it's the kids are thrown in jail, and the brother's thrown in jail, and so it's just a terrible, everybody pays the consequence.
Brother makes that clear, like if you can't do it for yourself, your own safety, your children's safety, can you just think of us? This will ruin us if this gets found out. So stay home or stay in that room. Don't come out, right? And how just imposing this must have been to Harriet, just to think that, oh my gosh, if I make one wrong move, there's going to be so much pain, anguish, and brutalization to everybody I care about.
Right.
Because holy hell will rain down. And this is the funniest thing about this whole thing is that, spoiler alert, she's gonna, when she eventually gets into the garage of the shed, she's gonna be there for 7 years. Horrible. But what's somewhat amusing about that is it's right across the street from Dr. Flint's home the whole time, and he never knew it.
Right. She says at one point that it's the safest place she could have been.
And that's saying something, because it was not, it wasn't safe as far as her day-to-day living there. And then another kind of disturbing yet funny thing about Mrs. Flint, she's always pointing out how lazy Miss Flint is, because she is. Where does it? Oh, yeah. Ellen, her daughter, is finally taken out of prison. She gets measles, which is terrible. This measles is bad enough today, but this is serious.
Yeah, deadly.
Luck, I can't believe she lived. But she's taken to the Flint's home, and Ellen just cries and sobs the whole time. And she has this intuitive she's never been in the Flint's home, but she understands that this is a bad place. And so she's begging, send me back to jail. Right? This is a little girl going, can I go back to jail, please? Crying her eyes out. And so you've got Miss Flint. Before the night, she called one of the slaves. She said, here, Bill, carry out this brat back to jail. I can't stand her noise. If she would be quiet, I should like to keep the little minx. She would make a handy waiting maid for my daughter by and by. But if she stayed here with her white face, again, she's mulatto, right? Using the term from back then, I suppose I should either kill her or spoil her. I hope the doctor will sell them as far as the wind and water will carry them. As for their mother, her ladyship will find out yet what she gets by running away. She hasn't so much a feeling for her children, so terrible, as a cow has for its calf. Disgusting. If she had, she would have come back long ago to get them out of jail and save all this expense and trouble. The good for nothing hussy, when she is caught, she shall stay in jail in irons for 6 months and then be sold to a sugar plantation. I shall see her broke in yet. What do you stand there for, Bill? Why don't you get off with that brat? Mind now that they don't let any of the N-words speak of her in the street. speak to her in the street.
Right.
Disgusting.
And what's so ironic, and I guess the real feeling is that she loves her kid so much that that's why she's doing it, right?
Yeah.
And we'll see it in the other chapter.
Yeah, I mean, parent of the year goes to Harriet Jacobs,
Right.
despite the whole situation.
Mhm.
Yeah, so chapter 19.
Mhm.
So in chapter 18, right, he gets some sort of indication that she's in New York, right? This is before Harriet very cleverly starts writing letters. So
Mhm.
he thinks she's in New York. And part of the reason why this is when we get to chapter 19, the children are going to get sold. And the main reason why they're going to get sold is it's interesting. He's a doctor, and back then doctors didn't make as much money as they do today, but you would think he would have some cash on hand.
Yeah.
So, but he has to go to the benefactor, this woman,
Mhm.
and borrow $500 from her sister
Mhm.
with interest,
Mhm.
which I thought was interesting. They're like, yeah,
No
interest.
pun intended.
Yeah.
It was interesting.
Yeah, and so he goes off to New York to go find her in vain. He's not going to find her because she's right across the street the whole time.
Yeah.
And he fails in this quest, but this gives Linda some more leverage, right?
Right. And when the children are sold to the father, right, to Mr. Sands, the guy who ran for Congress, the Whig candidate,
Yeah, very interesting.
when they're sold to him, it was through like some cunning, right, that he didn't know that he was selling it to his children.
Well, it was interesting. This is another example of a white person taking pity on the
Mhm.
enslaved. And it's kind of funny. I get the sense that this slave trader, that is, he approaches the slave trader and says, "Hey, will you buy these children? $1,900, I think, is what they're sold
Yeah, that's
for.
a lot of
A lot of
money.
money for children, especially, and a lot of money back then. And so he's intent on selling these children, but he's learning of the situation behind this and says, and arranges to sell these children to Mr. Sands.
Mhm.
And basically, I think what Linda suspects is this guy is he's just tired of the slave trader. He says, these are the most despicable people in the world.
Mhm.
I hate them all, but this particular man is, I think, at the point of, this is just horrible. And
Yeah.
here's this mother who's going through hell.
Mhm.
I'm gonna do her right and help
Mhm.
her out and get her children to
Yeah.
some semblance of safety.
And when she finally learned, so in page 93, Betty is telling her, right, how her children have been sold to the father. And then if you turn to page 94, it says, Betty went off laughing, and I said to myself, can it be true that my children are free? I have not suffered for them in vain, thank God. And I think that just like wraps up her point, right? She has suffered, but it was for a reason, right?
Yeah.
And so now she can say, I did not suffer in vain. Like mission accomplished, right? Check, my goal was to do this, and I've done that. And so she's happy. But of course, that doesn't mean that she's free. It means that her children have been bought.
Yeah.
And
And this is a big win for Linda.
Mhm.
Huge win. A win for her. And at the end of the chapter 94, I just thought this was a very insightful thing for her to say here. I had my seasons of joy and Thanksgiving. It was the first time since my childhood that I had experienced any real happiness. Wow.
Mhm.
Unbelievable. I mean, we're talking about our whole teenage years, which is,
Mhm.
if you guys, any teenagers out there, please enjoy it. It only gets worse, right? So please. So to rob her of that is such a tragedy. I heard the old doctor's threats, but they no longer had the same power to trouble me. The darkest cloud that hung over my life had rolled away. Whatever slavery might do to me, it could not shackle my children. If I fell a sacrifice. My little ones were saved. It was well for me that my simple heart believed all that had been promised for their welfare. It is always better to trust than to doubt. And that is such a beautiful line. And what
Right.
she's talking about is all these people that have helped her with tremendous risk to themselves, right? She had to trust them and open up to them again and again, going to her grandmother, explaining the situation with Mr. Sands, to this benefactor woman, to the slave trader. She has trusted, or she felt an intuitive sense, I could trust this person,
Right.
with no indication that that trust would have yielded any results, right? This all could have backfired her any second.
Yeah.
It's remarkable that she even gets freedom,
Yeah.
because there's part of the trouble reading this book. It's like, okay, another character, how are they related to this? It's like, okay, you
Yeah.
almost have to have almost like a yarn with note cards, like and try.
Yeah.
But
How
yeah, that
close.
line is so powerful. It is always better to trust than to doubt, which
Right.
is unbelievably difficult for her, I
Mhm.
believe. Yeah, so yeah, we get to chapter 20, new perils, more problems, as if she
Yeah.
doesn't have enough.
Yeah, so this is when he arrests the doctor in chapter 20. The doctor, more exasperated than ever, again tried to revenge himself on my relatives. He arrested Uncle Philip on the charge of having aided my flight. And that's like cooked up charges, because he doesn't have any proof, because there is no proof that
Yeah.
he helped them, because nobody helped her. She did it on her own. But I thought it was interesting where on page on the other page, on page 95, it says so she's hoping that her Uncle Philip does not get like more jumped up. I thought it likely Dr. Flint would do his utmost to taunt and insult him, which you think, like, to a man at one point, like what the breaking point of a man, right? Like that's what she's worried about. And I was afraid my uncle might lose control of himself and resort in some way that would be construed into a punishable offense. And I was well aware that in court, his word would not be taken against any white man, which is,
That's a law.
and it will be the law like till the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
That one, like white people couldn't testify, and
Oh, black people, yeah.
excuse me, yes, African Americans could not.
Or women.
And, right. And so that's just like baked into the cake, right? He cannot testify against a white man.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a great thing to point out, right? And what's just surprising, is there any passage in here where somebody just completely loses it, just goes insane? I think there is, but if there is, it's quite rare. I'm just putting myself in this situation. I would have lost. I mean, I get frustrated driving around traffic. I can't imagine under these conditions, these horrible conditions, of how you maintain your dignity.
Self-control, yes.
And just be like, how do I make the best of this under these terrible situations? And which again, these people, I think the leverage of being sold, you're just like, okay, I will try to do right by these people. I won't try to make any noise.
And even like, because I was thinking more and more like, okay, let's say that like Harriet Jacobs, she did take the step, but it's not like I'm gonna run away and then I'm free and I can live my life the way I want to. Like and it's also, you run away, you leave your family behind, right? Everything that you love and know, and go among strangers, and it's the fear of the unknown, right? You don't know if it's gonna go well for you, if it's gonna, like.
Better trust than to doubt. That's what I think she's operating on. Like, I don't know what's tomorrow's gonna bring, but sitting in this swamp or sitting in this garret is much better than the alternative. Oh, this is where, so she's still living with the benefactor in the spare room, and this is where she decides that she needs to leave because this woman, Jenny, a slave, is trying to get into the room, and Jenny is known for being kind of a turncoat, which is common among slaves. If you read any of the slave revolts, Stono Rebellion, Nat Turner's Rebellion, And any of these rebellions that you can read in any history textbook, they're all found out by a slave that turns them in, drops a dime, as the saying goes.
You
right?
know, I was watching I think it was a 60 Minutes. For some reason, it popped up into, like, my YouTube brain told me to watch, you know, how you get
My
those?
YouTube brain, I like it.
On who had, I guess, like, given up, or the Anne Frank.
Mhm.
And her family, that they had been in hiding for so long, and then somebody, and the new detectives say that it was another Jew.
Mhm.
And because now it's his family, right? Or there's some, I think that was the thing, that he had been like in the good favor, the good graces of the Nazis, that Jew. And that now they're thinking it was another Jew, and it's the same. So in all, like you said, it happens all the time.
Yeah, and I wrote in my notes that Linda, although doesn't really like Jenny, but she never blames Jenny personally, standing by her previous statement that it's almost impossible to act solely on one's moral impulses under slavery.
Right.
Right. And so, yeah, I mean, you can't blame
Yeah.
any of these enslaved people. Who knows, perhaps me or you would do the same thing. I might curry favor with with my enslavers and
Right.
get a little bit better treatment if I
Mhm.
turn these people in who are
Yeah.
causing trouble.
In that video that I watched on Anne Frank and the Jews, supposedly the father finds out, Otto, the father finds out that it was another Jew, and he keeps that to himself because he doesn't want more Jewish hate.
Mm,
And
Yeah.
so interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is the problem with the concept of essentialism, right? This is the whole backdrop of what's going on here. The individualism of Black people is robbed from them. They are
Mhm,
Black
mhm.
people, and this is what Black people are like. The individualism of women is robbed from them, right? Women need to be proper, they're virtuous, they're the ones that are gonna keep our Christian virtues intact, while the men are out corrupted in the public sphere, right? It's, and so to blame Jenny for doing this, it's horrible what Jenny's doing, but it's horrible for that person to do that, not as, how could a Black person do this to another Black person? These are just people, obviously, caught up in an impossible situation. And Jenny, she's this minor character, is just trying to etch out whatever she can in her life to make it more comfortable, right? Hey, anything else from chapter 20? I want to make sure we have time to talk about probably the most pressing plot arc, the Garrett. But yeah, let's see if there's anything else in chapter 20 we should be looking hold. Yeah. Oh, and when she leaves again, she is in the swamp, and this is where she is bitten by a snake in this horrible situation. And this is where this is going to lead to her getting into this garret of her grandmother's shed. Yeah, what were you saying?
Yeah, well, they realize that they cannot keep it, and that's why I say that the attempt is one thing, but then like living it out, the runaway slave living out their freedom.
Yeah.
His or her freedom is terrible.
Yeah, and then just to get to this theme of the alternative of sitting in a swamp that's filled with snakes is better, right? She writes, I could scarcely summon courage to rise, this is on page 97. But even those large venomous snakes were less dreadful to my imagination than the white men in that community called civilized. Right. So she would rather die in a swamp full of snakes than to be pestered by Dr. Flint. Yeah, so chapter 21, the loophole of retreat.
The small shed had been, a small shed had been added to my grandmother's house years ago. Some boards were laid across the joists at the top. And between these boards and the roof was a very small garret, never occupied by anything but rats and mice. So she's not in the nicest,
No. This is where, this book, published in 1861, was quickly discounted as a work of fiction of Maria Childs, who was a feminist and abolitionist that edited this book, right? And so she's a woman, she's Black. How could she write that? That's the main reason why this book is discounted and not believed for over 100 years. It's not until the 1970s that this book is going to begin to be assigned in colleges and high schools. But the other thing too that's at play here is how extraordinary this is. For 7 years. She is going to live in a space that is what, 6 by 9 feet and no taller than 3 feet and at a slant.
Right, so the
Right.
garret was only 9 feet long and 7 wide. The highest part was 3 feet high,
Yeah.
so.
And we have this kind of impressionist picture. Let me get out of the way real quick. That is Harriet contorted in the garret. And this is what she describes of how she was able to kind of sleep on one side
Mhm.
without falling over. That's how she slept for 7 years and just lived
Mhm.
for 7 years.
And she talks about how her I guess like her body had started to atrophy,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then so she has to start doing exercise. It's almost like she's going through physical therapy to try
How
to
do you
get that.
exercise in that?
Yeah, well, they open up the
Yeah, yeah. And to be fair, like not to be fair, but she does have moments where she's able to get out of this. There's one point where she,
Mhm.
at great risk to everybody, confronts Mr. Sands, goes and visits him, and to compel him to sell her children. Right. Oh, our producer's bossing us around. Thank you, producer. But yeah, what I would like just to kind of think about here is some point today, just take 20 minutes. That's it, 20 minutes, and just sit in an air-conditioned room. Get a nice fluffy pillow and sit on it, right? So your hips are a little bit elevated, and sit there and do nothing. Do nothing for 20 minutes. See if you can commit to that 20 minutes. It's the most difficult, and this is what she's doing by herself, alone with her
For 7
thoughts.
years. And that for her thoughts, she says, what does she think about her dreary past and uncertain future? Like, what are her prospects, right?
All she knows is she's in
yeah.
this garret today.
Right, and so I guess she feels like I can think of 2 things. I can think of my past, don't want to do that. I can think of my future, don't want to do that, so, but then she thinks of her children, and that's
That's what keeps her going.
mhm, mhm.
Yeah, and then, what we have to understand here is North Carolina's climate is very similar to our climate here in South Texas.
Mhm.
It's hot in the summers, and North Carolina is much colder in the winters. And the winters aren't as severe as they are up in the north, so the homes aren't insulated. She's living in a shed, a garret of a shed. So yeah, she basically is exposed to the elements. She talks about the rain coming in and how it made her even more cold, and how she would use that. She would get her bedding out of the way to make the floorboards a little cooler so she could lay on it to cool herself down. So just a horrible situation that she's in here. Okay. The Dr. Flint, did you? Oh, and I thought this, so he's
Excuse me, I had a question.
trying to find her, and I thought this was almost a touching scene of her son, Benny. He sees Dr. Flint coming in, and he runs up to Dr. Flint, her very young son. Dr. Flint, did you bring my mother home? I want to see her. The doctor stamped his foot at him in a rage and exclaimed, "Get out of the way, you little damned rascal. If you don't, I'll cut off your head." I mean, it's just, it's the nastiness is
Right.
how do you,
right.
why would you say that to a little kid? I'll
Mhm.
cut off your head? I mean, fine, like,
I
yeah,
think that's just in his nature and his
Yeah,
character.
yeah.
To just.
quite apparently, it's
Mhm,
just a terrible, vindictive, ugly, disturbed man,
mhm.
and a coward of a man
Right.
to add. But yeah, so yeah, this horrible situation that she's in. One thing I found really cool to learn about is what is that? What is this? So in chapter 22, well, let's hold off on chapter 22. Dr. Flint, I guess she's in New York. What is this? Dr. Flint and his family, this is page 100, and his family repeatedly tried to coax and bribe my children to tell them something they had heard or said about me. One day, the doctor took them into the shop and offered them some bright little silver pieces and gay handkerchiefs if they would tell them where their mother was. Ellen shrank, her daughter, from him and would not speak, but Benny spoke up and said, Dr. Flint, I don't know where my mother is. I guess she's in New York. And when you go there again, I wish you would ask her to come home, for I want to see her. But if you put her in jail or tell her you'll cut her head off, I'll tell her to go right back, right? Which is, I mean, this is disturbing, but we're beginning to see these children kind of grow into their own. He's talking back to this man, and she basically.
But I think it's like, when you go there again, because he's been going to.
Yeah, he keeps spending all of this money and at the
Right,
great
right.
expense of his estate.
Mhm.
Yeah. But yeah, so she's in there, and then so Christmas is approaching, and it's time to be merry, but not for enslaved people, because what does this mean? This is the time, a few days after Christmas, this is when everybody's sold, right? But they do have this interesting event. Where's
Jonicus or?
Jonicus? Yeah. So this is brought from West Africa. This is when men would dance and sing, and basically go around and ask for donations. They would get money from everybody in the community, white people, black people, and rum. All right. And if they didn't, they would have a song where they would shame the people that wouldn't donate, right? Poor master, do they say, down in the heel, so they say, got no money, so they say, not one shilling, so they say, God Almighty bless you, so they say, right? So yeah, if you didn't give them rum or you didn't give them any money through this festivity that happens around Christmas, yeah, they would shame you. This is kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, this is a time of peril for enslaved people in this community, because this is when slave traders come around and they start selling off people.
In the new year, yeah.
So getting to the end of this chapter, she's cut a hole. Her uncle Philip had made the trap door and tried to make the place as livable as possible. And so she has this little tool where she's able to cut some holes and to see her children, which is a great benefit to her. And she gets to see the townspeople talking. And what is reassuring to her is most people are convinced that she is nowhere around, right? She's somewhere up north.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's like, it's kind of like, a man should have his property. She hears people saying. Yeah, another one's like, I wouldn't go get her, like, leave her alone. And it's just kind of like the hearsay of the village there, the town.
Yeah. And then, so still in prison, chapter 28, getting towards the end of our talk here. She's contemplating just her situation, and she's thinking of Dr. Flint. With all destination of Dr. Flint, I could hardly wish him a worse punishment, either in this world, and this is page 1 of 3, or punishment, either in this world or which is to come, than to suffer which I suffered in one single summer. Yet the laws allowed him to be out in the free air, while I, guiltless of crime, was pent up here as the only means of avoiding the cruelties the laws allowed him to inflict upon me. I don't know what kept life within me. Again and again, I thought I should die before long, but I saw the leaves of another autumn whirl around the air and felt the touch of another winter. In the summer, the most terrible thunderstorms were acceptable, for the rain came through the roof, and I rolled up, so on and so forth. She's explaining this, but she's basically, lamenting of how unfair this is. Here I am in this garret in the most pathetic situation one could possibly think of in service of my children, yet this man is able to breathe air freely and the
Right.
laws protect him.
So the injustice of it, all,
Mhm.
the injustice of it all is what she's starting to feel.
Yeah. And and then we get to see some more horrors of slavery. There's this poor woman that she sees through the peepholes. She hears her talking, crying as she's walking by. It's his own, and he can kill it if he will. So she's referring to this child that she's had with her enslaver, and the mistress of this plantation has found out and has kicked her and this baby out of their home. The master finds out and says, "Hey, I'll talk to my wife," but to no avail. And he ends up selling the mother and the slave to some enslavers to Georgia, right? And then we see another account of somebody who, another time a woman rushed wildly, pursued by two men. She was a slave, the wet nurse of a mistress' children. For some trifling offense, her mistress ordered her to be stripped and whipped. To escape the degradation and the torture, she rushed to the river, jumped in, and ended her wrongs in death, suicide, right? And then she evokes this Senator Brown from Mississippi, right? Who could not be any more ignorant of such facts of these, for they are of frequent occurrence in every southern state. Yet he stood up in Congress of the United States and declared that slavery was, quote, a great moral, social, and political blessing, a blessing to the master and a blessing to the slave, right?
That is taking, like, twisting fact.
Oh, yeah, to say the least, this terrible situation that is happening. And then we get on page 104, I found this quite disturbing given the context of the time and her situation and how much her faith meant to her. So she's basically praying to God. Sometimes I thought God was compassionate Father who would forgive me of my sins for the sake of my sufferings. At other times, it seemed to me there was no justice or mercy in this divine government, not government as in the United States, but as in heaven and God itself. I asked why the curse of slavery was permitted to exist and why I had been so persecuted and wronged from youth upward. These things took the shape of mystery, which is to this day not so clear to my soul, and I trust it will be hereafter. Right.
Just questioning her faith.
Yeah.
And her, beliefs and taking it, like appealing to a higher power. I feel like, just like, okay, I'm not saying Dr. Flint, and it's like, I'm looking at you, God, and saying, why do you allow this? That's kind of what I take from that.
Kind of, yeah. You can almost see her as up on the cross in this garret. And as Jesus said, Father, why have you forsaken me? Right? Even Jesus is like, look at me, man. This is terrible, right? The situation I'm in. What's up?
Right.
I thought you were the God of love.
Right.
And then we get to see another incident of, as a parent, I don't know how she was able to stay in the garret. She sees her son covered in blood. He had been bitten by a dog. And then we get to see some more of Mrs. Flint's terrible behavior. As Mrs. Flint went out, this is page 105, Sally told her the reason Benny was lame, her son, and that the dog had bitten. I'm glad of it, she replied. So just stupid. I wish he had been killed. I wish he had killed him. It would have been good news to send to his mother. Her day will come. The dogs will grab her yet. Now, she is being quite literal with that. With these Christian words, she and her husband departed, and to my great satisfaction, returned no more. And then to close out, it sounds like her grandmother just basically had a nervous breakdown and fell ill. It's just the stress of worrying about Linda and the situation she was in was just too much, but she's recovering. And then she ends this chapter. I heard from my Uncle Philip with feelings of unspeakable joy and gratitude that the crisis was past and grandmother would live. I could now say from my heart, God is merciful. he has spared me the anguish of feeling that I caused her death, right? Which would have probably been one toke over the line for her. I think that
Right.
would have destroyed Linda
Right.
if she had died.
Right, and just to close up, and if we all have any questions, this would be
Yeah,
the time to
please.
put it. So Dr. Flint's wife, of course, does not have Christian feeling. And when Aunt Martha, the grandmother, gets sick, Aunt Nancy, who works for Dr. Flint's wife, and Nancy one night asked permission to watch her sick mother, and Mrs. Flint replied, "I don't see any need of you going. I can't spare you."
Yeah,
But when she found out other ladies in the neighborhood were so attentive, not wishing to be outdone in her Christian charity, she also sallied forth in magnificent condescension and stood beside the bed of her who had loved her in her infancy and who had been repaid by such grievances. So it's all an act, right? It's all, not that she was really worried, but her appearance, like, how is this gonna look, right? That everyone's going and I'm not going, and, so yeah.
yeah, it's all checking boxes for the Flints, right?
Right.
They want to keep up with appearances and it's, right, and it's.
And the funny thing is that everybody knows that they're rotten to the core.
Yeah, I get the real sense that even other white people in town find these people despicable.
Which is why Mr. Sands helps, and the white benefactress, I guess they saw also the
Yeah,
injustices of the
mhm,
situation.
yeah. And so we do have some other chapters to cover, but we are running short on time. There was a lot in these chapters,
We'll
so.
just have to include them in the next one.
Yeah, but I would definitely employ you to read on to the candidate for Congress, Mr. Samuel, what's his name? His real name, Samuel Sewell?
Sewell, yes.
Yeah. So this is a real person running for Congress as a Whig candidate, which is interesting because this is at the height of the antebellum. This is when tensions are rising, and the Whig Party represented basically an institution where both Southerners and Northerners who had nothing in common. They had a lot of political differences. The thing they had in common, though, is they all hated Andrew Jackson. And so he's running on that ticket, which is probably controversial in that area, even though Whigs are prominent in the South. The Democratic Party is still pretty powerful in the South. And so.
And he switches sides. Dr. Flint switches sides because
Yeah.
Mr. Sands. I use, in the American PowerPoint, this election day, and you see the image, the painting of election, the county election, I think it's
Mhm.
called. It's for chapter Democracy in America.
Mhm.
And there's an African American pouring like some sort of beverage. You don't remember the image?
No.
And I used it today in class, and I read from Harriet Jacobs about how they're passing out brandy and he wants them to vote Democrat.
Mm.
And it says they're like, where is it? Just quickly, but it says, two candidates were running for Congress and he returned in season to vote. Dr. Flint, the father of my children, was a Whig candidate. The doctor had hitherto been a staunch Whig, but now exerted all his energies for the defeat of Mr. Sands. So it's like a it's a personal political vendetta campaign against him. He invited large parties of men in to dine in shade of his trees and supplied them with plenty of rum and brandy.
Mm.
And if they said they weren't voting a Democrat, he'd throw them out.
Yeah, which is another kind of win for Linda, Harriet.
Right.
He's spending money. He's trying to sabotage Mr. Sands' campaign and spending money at his expense to do this. And so it's just like, yeah, keep digging the hole, Dr. Flint.
Deeper.
You are going to lose eventually, and he will lose.
Are they asking for the sign-in sheet?
There was one
Yeah,
comment that said, I kind of got mixed up with the timeline.
yeah.
I thought Mr. Sands bought his children.
He does. He does buy his children, and this is through the machinations of the slave trader who is able to sell the children to Mr. Sands. And they have this big ruse too.
Mhm.
Grandmother Philip is out there, William is out there, and they're crying. They're never going to see these children again, full well knowing where they're going.
But being bought by the Mr. Sands, he owns them, but what Harriet wants is now to set them free.
Yeah.
because he's, and we don't have time to get to it, but he's like, if their money situation changes, it's like liquidate, we need cash, and they're gonna sell my kids, and I don't want them sold again, because the father owns them, but then he marries, right? And he's thinking, if the wife has a problem with my children, she's gonna tell him, sell them, because you own them, right? He hasn't given them their freedom. And so now, because that's what happened to her,
Yeah,
right? She was sold, she was property that was like handed, so she's like, I don't want the same story to repeat itself with my daughter, right? That she's not free, that she's, given to, because of pecuniary, or what's the word, like problems, right? Money problems.
Mhm.
So that's where we're at. So we'll tune in next time.
Yeah. And the greater point about Mr. Sands is something that, when she realized what she made a great mistake by getting involved with Mr. Sands is, he doesn't view them as his children, they're
Right,
property,
right.
right? And so he's doing what he can to be somewhat kind. I mean, you can argue it is an act, he didn't have to buy them, and that buys Linda some time. He's not as cruel as, in any way, as Dr. Flint. But, what is stopping him from
Social norms,
selling he's not a plantation owner, he doesn't need their labor. And so it would really be, and has plenty of money, so it's not like, oh gosh, I better hold on to these kids in case I'm ever broke. He's set. And so I think it is social norms. It's trying to hold up appearances too, I believe, is probably what's at play here. People will look down on him if he does sell the
And what
children.
does the wife say, Mr. Sands? Oh, what a pretty Negro boy,
Mhm.
to his own son, right? Like,
Yeah.
who does he belong to? And it's always like, it's like, whose child is he, right? But it's like, who does he belong to? Like, whose property is this?
Yeah.
Almost like asking. So
Yeah,
I think
it's
we're out of time.
Yeah, did any questions or comments come in? Yeah, okay, yeah, we can call it here just to make sure that we're holding the time constraint. We could talk a lot more on this, but we will come back and see her finally get to the north, and overall, no spoiler alerts, but to the great extent that was possible, to the limited extent that's possible, things are going to work out. But at a great expense. She's not able to walk correctly, as she spent 7 years almost entirely in that garret, except for a few occasions. But we'll take a look at what basically we'll close out the book with our next talk, getting us to chapter 36. The sign-in sheet has been posted in the chat, so go ahead and sign in. Let us know in the chat if you're having problems signing in. Otherwise, just use the chat there. What is that? We do not have editing. Okay, I can fix that real quick.